Tell us about your background and your career, about yourself. Mm.
Yeah, so my background, I think, is quite typical of a lot of people who end up in service design, in that there isn't one path into service design. So originally, I studied art at university, and then went to work for the Tate Gallery as a writer and then a producer. And I had a moment when I was installing a audio guide into the museum that was for use on people's mobile phones. And there was a person putting a sign up in the gallery that said, "Please don't use your mobile phone." And at that moment, I thought, oh, it's probably important that people design the entire experience of going to the gallery, including the audio tours and the signage and the ticketing. So that's what led me to service design. And I worked in agencies, mostly in a lot of corporate work before joining government as well, where I started, which was the first service designer, to where I ended up, which was Director of Service Design and Standards. So looking after the part of the UK government that sets the standards for public services and makes sure that all of the bits of government that need to do that and need to design better services can have the materials that they need in order to be able to do that. So things like design patterns and training and skills and community development. And everything in between. So yeah, and then after doing that, I wrote a book called Good Services about really the things that any service needs to do to work for its users. And I suppose that was written partly out of frustration because I had that conversation many, many times with so many people on repeat. And so I thought, well, if I write it down, then at least people can read it without having to have me explain it to them. And yeah, and then 4 years later, I'm running the School of Good Services, and we provide training and coaching and upskilling to all sorts of different organizations in how to design and deliver better services for their users. So
Um,
yeah.
Now you have a new book,
Mhm.
and we are interested that you change a bit. The title of the first book was Good Services, How to Design Services That Work. And now
Mhm.
you're talking about bad services. Why
Yeah.
this change?
So I think the first thing that I should say about bad services is that it's not about just looking at bad services. And as much as I think probably a lot of service designers can learn a huge amount by looking at services that go wrong. There's enough of that actually in good services. So good services, although it's very positive, has a lot of examples of bad services and what not to do in it. Um, Ironically, bad services is a lot more positive. And actually, it's about how we build organizations that can design and deliver better services, and why we get ourselves in the situation so often where we aren't able to do that, and where we kind of perpetually keep building and delivering bad services. So that's why it's called bad services. It's really about why we end up in the situation where we're delivering bad services and what we can do about it. And I'm writing that because I realized after delivering hundreds, probably thousands of hours of training to many, many people, is that the thing that they're really struggling with is how to ultimately kind of negotiate and embed the types of things that we're talking about in good services within their organization. So how do they help their organization to see and understand their users? How do they help their organization to become less risk averse? How do they help the structure of their organization support the services that they're trying to design and deliver? And really, without doing that, often what we end up doing is designing lots of really great ideas, and those ideas don't get delivered. So this is really a book about how we get the ideas that are coming up in good services to be delivered.
Do you think it changed a lot the 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 situation in the governments, in the public sector since first book now?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 4 years, so things change a lot. I mean, aside from the political changes, which have definitely happened in the UK, we have a new government in that time. And the political changes that have happened worldwide, there's been a sort of global shift to more conservative policies in general, I would say. That's kind of an uncontroversial thing to say. um, that has definitely put pressure on public services being egalitarian and open and user focused, because the more right-wing a government is, the less likely it is probably going to be spending a huge amount of effort thinking about things like public welfare and thinking about the most vulnerable in society. And you can read my politics in that that statement, but that's certainly how it appears to me in my experience. So there's the political side of it. I mean, the other side of it is just I think, the long tail of kind of digitization of government services has really progressed. That will always be there. There will always be PDFs. There will always be phone lines. There will always be face-to-face only services or postal only services. But I think those are getting fewer and fewer. And with that, I think there's a bit of a change in people's perspectives from certainly 10 years ago, where the internet was a kind of something that if we did a digital service, we could really pat ourselves on the back for. Now it's very much, if we don't do this, we are really, really in trouble. And I think that message has kind of shifted quite a lot. But same time, budgets have got tighter with a lot of organizations, and so they're having to do that work, often to the most complicated services that they left till last, with the fewest people, with the smallest amount of budget. And I think a lot of that energy around designing things that work for users, about doing them in an agile, open, iterative way, is still there, but it's more complex, and maybe it's harder to hear some of those messages. So I think we are starting to see a little bit of a diffraction in the quality of some digital services because of that, because a movement can only kind of stay clear for so long, I think. So I think there's a little bit of a resurgence that needs to happen around shifting the message from being about digital services, and isn't it great that we have them on the internet, to how do we actually go beyond just digitizing what we have already and making those things work for people, and agnostic of structures, and using the true functionality of digital technology, and overcoming all of those organizational silos and barriers that we had before, when we were sort of taking something and just putting it on the internet. So yeah, it's a mixed picture. I think there's some really
because, as you have said, the situation have changed in so many axes or ways. But can we say that service design has grown up? That it is that when maybe 10 years ago it was like childhood of service design, and everybody was like, we can do this, and now like we are adults that know, well, maybe there are things that we can do this way. So it's like service design has to grown up.
I think it's interesting, because I'm now so old that I've heard that saying before. And it was about 10 years ago, and they were like, service designers definitely grown up. And I'm with you. I definitely am with you. But I think there's something inherently optimistic and something inherently naive about service design that's actually really, really important to keep. And it's that idealism and that belief that it is, even though very, very difficult to do, really important to bring together all of the different parts of a service as one experience for a user. And so I think I feel slightly ambivalent about that idea of kind of growing away from that aspect of service design, that idealism and that optimism, because I think that's so important. And I also see that still in the industry, and I see it in people who have been there for 20 years, and I see it in people who are just coming into the industry, which is great. I think the growing up bit of it, though, is actually acknowledging that this is difficult. I think that's what I've certainly started to see. And books like Bad Services, but also books like The Service Organization by Kate Tarling, which is fantastic, are really acknowledging actually what are the materials of the organization that we have to design with, rather than, you know, kind of going, okay, we want the service to be like this, isn't it fantastic? And oh no, a silo. Oh no, a difficult stakeholder. Like actually acknowledging that that is just the reality of delivering a service, and this is part of our work, and training people in that and learning how to do it is also just really, really important. So yeah, I'm with you, Jose. I do think there has been some growing up, but I also don't want it to grow up completely. Like I don't want it to become the kind of cynical, you know, everything is complicated, whataboutery kind of profession that it could be. I think it needs to remain optimistic.
Yes, maybe we are some kind of teenagers or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
In the middle of, but when you was talking, I was thinking that, for instance, nowadays, here in my position, I'm finding that there are some governments that are trying to change the difficult service, the internal services, the things that they never wanted to do. That sometimes we were been working with, you know, some services related with people, but it's just a vertical or some silo, and now they are trying to change the things that that had a relative impact in all the governance. So I think that it is fine because we are growing up, not only not being as naive as we should be, just trying to change what it is important. So maybe it's an interesting moment. What do you think about this? Have you find some these difficult services?
I think so. I think what's really fascinating is, like you, I'm starting to see service designers popping up in places that I didn't expect them to be, which is really great. And they're often places where they can't talk about their work. So, you know, I'm starting to see service designers embedded in prisons, and in the healthcare system, and, you know, in other areas of, you know, calculating kind of climate impact and other things like that. And I think that's really, really great to see, because it used to be, I mean, I'm talking about back in the first days of service design, to 2008, maybe that kind of time. It was really only the big, rich corporate clients that could afford it, and the local authorities and charities. So it was like these two kind of ends of the spectrum. You had, you know, massive corporates who would chuck loads of money and loads of consultants at, you know, making the billing process of, you know, sending a mobile phone bill better, but which, by the way, is still not great in a lot of places. And then you had the charities and the local authorities trying to do really great stuff on a tiny little shoestring. I think what's really interesting is that middle space of, you know, startups, small organizations, medium-sized businesses, family businesses, areas where actually you would think talking about user needs would be challenging and difficult. So, you know, in the courts and prisons system, those sorts of things, that actually that started to really move forward and develop its own culture around what service design looks like in those contexts, which I think is really fantastic. So, yeah.
Okay, I think this one you answered it a bit, but what do you think that are the main goals that service design has achieved in these years? And what do you think it's coming?
I mean, I don't think I can speak for the achievements of all of service design, because I don't know what they all are. And, you know, I think if I were to list all of the achievements of service design, it would be very much from the perspective that I'm coming at it from, and I would naturally overlook all of the fantastic stuff that's happening in other countries and in other areas and other communities. So I wouldn't want to summarize that. But I think if I were to sort of collectively give us all a pat on the back, I would probably say the thing that we've really achieved is visibility, and in a lot of places credibility as well. And that has been really, really hard won. You know, going back to that, what I was saying about the optimism and the idealism, it's hard to maintain that when, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50% of our job is just explaining why we're in the room in the first place and saying, okay, we need to talk about users, and bringing these things together is really expensive and it's going to take a really long time, but it's important. And that maintained energy that we put to that work, I think, as a global community, I think has been really, really important. And I think another thing that I would say as well is the generosity of the community in sharing toolkits and sharing user research and kind of talking to each other on social platforms about bettering the community, bettering our work, making it more inclusive. I think there was definitely a time where service design, like most industries, was not the most inclusive of industries, and we did make mistakes because of that. And I think there's been some really fantastic efforts to move that forward, and also some very some humble and brilliant responses from people who are senior in the community who needed to change. So I think that has been really fantastic to watch, actually. And I think many people who probably were there at the very beginning of service design, which I kind of missed, I think would acknowledge that they probably never quite thought that it would end up where it has. I think it was very much an idea of, wouldn't it be great if we designed services as things? And I think they would probably be very proud of where it has ended up. So yeah, I think that they're more kind of general things, but like I said, I wouldn't want to speak for everyone's experience, because the fantastic thing about service design now is that it is so varied and it happens everywhere and it's so diverse, and everyone has their own amazing achievements to talk about.
Yeah, but about yourself, you have talked about visibility, and you are one of the most visibility person in this issue, in this service design thing. How do you feel about this position that you have in the community? Do you feel that you have some influence in people?
So I recently, someone told me that they were talking to an AI tool about service design, and that it used my voice, which I was really creeped out by. So maybe, I don't know. I think there's some influence that I'm having that I'm not aware of, potentially. Yeah, I think everyone sort of feels probably ambivalent about having influence on something, and if you don't, then possibly you need to kind of check your privilege. So yeah, I feel it slightly kind of the weight of that responsibility a little bit, but I think increasingly I am starting to see it being important to use my voice to make service design more realistic and more inclusive. And I think, going back to what I was saying about what the industry has done to change, I think one thing that I'm seeing is still really important to talk about is just acknowledging how difficult this profession is within the context of the organizations that we're in, which often we're the only person doing that job. We're the person who's bringing all of this stuff together. We're advocating for users. We're often doing it in contexts where that user is very vulnerable, they can't speak for themselves within the organization, and that puts a huge amount of pressure on service designers. And so that's what we've really tried to do with the school, is to create learning materials and training and coaching and support in the types of skills that people need in those contexts to be able to do that work. So things like writing business cases for service design, or leading stakeholders, or talking about sustainability, or prototyping, and to really try and kind of hold up that community and support it. But also offering, kind of free bursary places, and trying to kind of address the sort of imbalance that there often is in professional networks towards people who have the privilege to be able to, do what is essentially quite a professionally risky job sometimes. We're often having to point out that something's wrong at the same time as being told that we shouldn't be causing too many problems, and that can feel like a very difficult place to be if you don't have the confidence and privilege to be able to kind of make your voice heard in those contexts. So I think our role is very much kind of supporting people to do that really important work and supporting the industry to be a more diverse and inclusive place, I think, increasingly.
What do you think are the main changes that public governments must face to improve public services right now?
Let me give you my list. I think the things that are needed are pretty straightforward, but they're actually quite difficult to do. So I think the first one is that we need to get rid of the assumption that leadership means being detached from the detail of the delivery of your ideas. I think that is the most fundamental damaging thing to service delivery that probably the 80s and 90s has ever taught us, that we need to kind of just get rid of, because that is the thing that's causing the separation between this kind of decision-making part of organizations and the delivery part of the organizations, and that mistranslation that happens between there, where the delivery part of the organization will see the challenges that users are facing and see how that service needs to work, but they're facing a very top-down organization that isn't listening to them. So I think kind of getting rid of that assumption that separation between ideas and delivery of ideas is a good thing is kind of just needs to just go. And that's not just in government, that's in the private sector as well, equally guilty of doing that. And with that, I think there needs to be a real reconnection with who our users actually are and what they need, and on a regular basis, not just as one-off user research that we do around a particular change to our project, but actually as an empathy building exercise for the organization to be able to make better decisions and more informed decisions based on what people need on a daily basis. How are our finance decisions affected by users? How are our operational decisions affected by users? All of those things should be, but they're not at the moment. The third thing I would say is kind of, and I think this is true of a lot of organizations, is de-escalating our kind of risk aversion. I think the kind of global financial, political kind of situation that's around us at the moment has forced a lot of organizations to be very conservative in their approach to everything. So, they're worried about making mistakes, they're worried about spending money, they're, being very, very cautious. But that caution is leading us into a position where we are not taking the types of small risks that will alleviate the big risk of our service failing in the future. So, we're not experimenting, so we're not making better services, so we're not solving the problems that we need to, and it's really a false economy. So I think sort of taking an organizational breath and actually saying, okay, well, let's really look at these risks, and going back to what you were saying, Jose, about kind of growing up service design, actually acknowledging there are risks to our work and talking about what they are, and seeing them a bit in a bigger context. I think that's really important. And then, I'll keep going, but I'll add one more, which I think is really important. I think talking about technical literacy in our organization is really important, and with a no judgment, safe space approach to helping everyone in the organization understand really basic and fundamental concepts like data. How does data work? Why is it important? How does it underpin our services? Those sorts of things. Because without having those conversations, we are starting to make mistakes with the technology choices that we're making. Same mistakes we've always been making, like really long contracts that we can't get out of, or thinking that, an off-the-shelf AI engine will solve everything. But we need to stop making those mistakes so that we can have more money to experiment, and we can, kind of actually make better services. So I think technical literacy for everyone in the organization, so that we can feel comfortable talking about the technology and the materials that our services are made of, because, what something's made of and how it works are fundamentally linked. And we know that as people who make services, but that isn't often clear to the wider organization. And I think just understanding the material of the internet and of digital technology is really important to make those decisions. But yeah, this is the sort of stuff that I'm writing about in Bad Services. So
And how do you create this design mood in the organization when things that you are telling happens?
I don't think there's one way of doing that, but I think actually it is about creating a design mood, honestly. I think it's about people at every level of the organization feeling like they have the ability to be able to talk about and input into the design process. And that doesn't mean designing a service by committee, but it means that it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that that service works, so that, you know, the person who's making the finance and, you know, HR decisions knows what impact those decisions will have on the team who's delivering a service, and it isn't, you know, something that's really far off for them. So I think it is about a mood and an atmosphere, actually, that everyone feels like they are part of one thing. They're part of delivering a thing. And, you know, often that comes down to things like, you know, building communities of practice, helping people to share skills, doing show and tells so that everyone knows what the service is and what's changing about it, celebrating success as well. I think we overlook that, but, you know, we spend so much time talking about what we can improve about a service and we forget to celebrate when we've actually done something really great. That's so important for building that momentum and that feeling that everyone wants to be part of that. And it, you know, with gov.uk, it was incredible the transition that people had and how they felt about design as soon as we won a Design of the Year awards, and, you know, we were in the UK Design Museum. So there was I think it's about celebrating design and about celebrating that as an achievement and helping people to realize what impact they've had in that. And making it fun, making it something that people want to be part of, you know, like a huge part of what we did at Government Digital Service in the design team was just communications, you know, stickers, posters, talking about our work, blogging, videos, making it seem like something that people wanted to stick on their laptop, they wanted to be part of. And that was a huge part of what we did as well. So yeah, I think that's not to be overlooked. I think it's really important.
Can you share with us some good practices related with public services?
You know what? I spend so much of my time, having just said we need to celebrate success, I spend so much of my time talking about things that are bad. It's hard to think about the things that are good. Things that are good.
Yeah, or good practices that you want
Yeah,
to.
good practice. I think it's particularly difficult with good practice because a lot of the clients that I work with are doing that stuff confidentially and they're not talking about it. So I feel like I can't really necessarily name names and saying this organization is doing this particular thing because that's their story. I think one thing that I think is happening that's really brilliant at the moment, and I mentioned it earlier on, is service design becoming more embedded in the kind of justice system. But what I'm seeing, certainly here in the UK, is that that's being done in a very pragmatic and interesting and different way. So rather than having a kind of detached central service design team who, you know, occasionally turn up in the context of delivery, I'm starting to see service designers embedded in those organizations at the front line of service delivery, and they are tasked with prototyping services live in real time at the point of delivery. And I think that the reason why I think that's such a great thing to see is because I think part of what maybe service design has been a little bit guilty of is being too strategic and not enough involved in the making and the doing of the doing. And so that's, you know, often led to some of our ideas just not being practical or deliverable. So it's really great to see that happening. There's other examples I can think of in the healthcare system as well, and this is happening globally. But seeing again service designers embedded into hospitals and into frontline care, and they're doing very similar things, of taking those services and really starting to kind of work on them in real time. And I think there's some great examples as well out there of services that are thinking beyond just inclusion to actually think about co-design with the communities that they are delivering to. And I think there's some wonderful work happening, particularly in Australia, to do that as well, and actually co-designing with particularly Indigenous communities to be able to deliver better services for those communities. So I think there's some really great examples of being embedded in delivery, being much closer to the practicalities of the service itself, but also being much more inclusive than just doing extractive user research, but actually, kind of supporting and raising up the voices of the communities that we're designing the services with. So a little bit less of the kind of service designer as the seagull, 1,000 miles above strategically, and a bit more of being embedded in the actual work, I think is really fantastic to see.
You have talked about inclusive design on all these things, and we want to talk to you about some trends. Firstly, I have seen the preliminary works of the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the UK government about planet-centered design. I feel that they are really interesting and really important, but the question is if we are ready for planet-centered design or not.
I mean, no, we're not ready, but we have to be. I think this is the thing. I mean, this is like with every important social movement, the vast majority of the people who are affected by that thing will not be ready to make those changes, but it's our job to help. And that's why earlier on this year we launched a course focusing on sustainable services. And the reason why we talked about sustainability was to be pragmatic and to talk about that kind of middle space, because obviously sustainability at the moment is not sustainable. We can't carry on with the current consumption. It's actually about reduction of our impact on the planet rather than sustainable. But I think there's a real missing gap actually in helping organizations to firstly understand why they need to care beyond just doing the right thing, because it will impact them. We're starting to see businesses, just this week, physical businesses going out of business because of huge amounts of flooding in the UK, and that is happening, in a much grander scale everywhere. We're starting to see huge global impacts of our work. But it's also important from the perspective of service design, and going back to that question of ethics, and really doing the right thing, is that we shouldn't be in a situation where we are recommending changes to a service that don't consider our impact on the planet. And I think it's a little bit of sort of just adding another layer to the people that we're thinking about. We think about individuals, that's great. We need to think about society, also great. We need to think about our organizations, yes, but we also need to think about the planet that all of those things exist on as well. And yeah, I think that it's a huge area, and the more people that can be talking about it, the better. And the less, I think we need to be quite careful with things like this, that we don't pick holes in progress and say, well, that's not doing that thing properly, and this is how we should all be doing kind of planet-centered design. It's just important that we talk about it. It's just important that we get comfortable with that idea. And whatever an organization does at this stage to improve its impact on the planet is better than nothing in my books. So I think that's a real area that we're starting to focus on, is actually helping organizations to really start to understand their impact on the planet, and to be able to make even small pragmatic changes right now. So yeah, it's huge. And I really do hope that we spend more time talking about it, and that it doesn't become just a temporary the conversation that fizzles out because it's hard to do. You know, it's going to be hard, but it's vital that we do it.
Last question. What do you think about artificial intelligence and how we can improve public services with artificial intelligence, and maybe if it could be useful for service design in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it's here. It's already here. People are already using it. And I think there are loads of opportunities to use artificial intelligence for service design, both in the design process, to speed up the bits that take us a long time. But there are also opportunities to provide better, more inclusive, more intelligent services as a result. I do genuinely believe that there are some benefits to it as a technology. Having said that, there are also some potential problems that it exacerbates and accelerates. And one of them is the lack of transparency that we have around decision making in our services. So most services will make some sort of decision at some point, particularly public services that are saying, you know, you get this benefit or you don't get this benefit, or you get to move into this house rather than in this house, or you're going to prison for this reason rather than, you know, like there are decisions that need to be made. And we're really bad, generally speaking, across the board at explaining why we're making those decisions and being transparent about them to our users and giving them any kind of agency in that situation. And what I worry about with any kind of technology that speeds up that decision-making process and automates it and takes it further away from human beings is that we have less visibility and less control of those decisions that we're making. And I think we've been seeing for years the algorithmic decision making, if it's designed by a very narrow set of people, will end up being biased towards that narrow set of people. So we see, racist algorithms in the court system. We've seen algorithms with Facebook tagging and identifying, human photographs of people of color, as non-human. We are already making those sorts of mistakes because of the biases of people who are making those algorithms and making those artificial intelligence kind of entities. So I think there's more transparency that's definitely needed around that before we start applying it wholesale to our services. And I think we should definitely learn the lesson that, just because something is new does not mean that it is going to create a better world for us. And particularly, going back to that question of climate impacts, AI is having a massive impact on the climate. There's a lot of data, it's a lot of processing. And yeah, I think we should really question that before we leap to saying, this is the new thing and we should all do it. It may not be the answer for everyone. And I think there's definitely some more testing and more kind of transparency about decision making, more transparency about the data that we're holding that's needed before many organizations make that leap into applying it in any way to their services. So yeah, that's me being a cautious perspective on this perhaps, but I think it's important.
That's fine, because AI is a compulsory question here in 2024, so we have to put the foundations of what we are going to build with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Jose. It's about like making sure that the foundations that we build that technology on are good and are working and are things that we understand. And going back to that thing we were talking about around technical literacy in our organization, we kind of need to work on that alongside bringing in these new technologies. Otherwise we will end up making the same mistakes but faster.
I don't know if you want to talk about anything else.
Any wish?
So. Yeah. Well, I would say I have a wish for anyone who's listening or reading this to look after themselves, because as we're told on aeroplanes, attach your mask first before helping other people. Service design is often a profession where we spend 99% of our time thinking about other people. Spend a little time thinking about yourself and making sure that you're okay doing this work, because it is difficult. And the other thing I'd just say is, the book will be out at some point next year. And I hope that it will be helpful to the types of conversations that we've had already today. So yeah, and thank you. Thanks for
No,
asking me to have this conversation.